Shalom Aleichem, Shalom Aleichem. Baruch Hashem Elohim, Baruch Hashem Abiyah, Baruch Hashem Adonai Yah HaMashiach, or otherwise known as praise the name or bless the name of Jesus, praise or bless the name of Jesus Christ, Yeshua HaMashiach, Yesu Yamasihi. Welcome to Fellowship of the First Resurrection Church and Synagogue. This is our midweek Bible study service. If you're joining us here in person in Mississippi, Shalom Aleichem. If you're joining us in Kenya with First Resurrection Fellowship Kenya, the satellite locations, Shalom Aleichem. If you are joining us via live stream in Southern California with First Resurrection Fellowship SoCal, Shalom Aleichem to you. And for everyone watching via live stream virtually, on the synagogue's website, firstresurrectionfellowship.com, or if you're watching the live stream on Rumble or YouTube, Shalom Aleichem to you as well. Peace be unto you. All right, we ask that all of the women cover their heads. We ask that all of the men uncover their heads. Again, we ask for all of the women to cover their heads, and we ask for all of the men to uncover their heads. Tonight's Bible study, and we ask that you remain that way for the duration of the service. Tonight's Bible study, we're going to be wrapping up the book of Genesis. So we'll be concluding the book of Genesis with Genesis chapter 50. So tonight we're dealing with Genesis, or Bereishit, chapter 50, the deaths of Israel and Joseph. The deaths of Israel and Joseph. Israel being Jacob, right? So again, tonight's Bible study, Genesis, Bereishit, chapter 50, the deaths of Jacob and Joseph. Right, so we're going to be wrapping up the book of Genesis, and then Im Adonai Yaira, if the Lord wills, or if the Lord provides, this Shabbat Eve, we're going to do a review of the book of Genesis, and then for the KABBALAT Shabbat service, and then for the Shabbat Mikra, right, or the Shabbat assembly, that following morning, we're going to do Bible Jeopardy. So we're going to have an exam. It'll be 50 questions, but it's going to be Bible Jeopardy like we normally do. Y'all should already be familiar with that. The only change this time is I'm not to make it more fair, and because I want people to be able to actually utilize their notes, because I did encourage people to take notes as we've been going throughout the book of Genesis, to take notes on your own. And I want people to be able to go back and refer to their notes when we're doing the Jeopardy. So when we do the Jeopardy next Shabbat, all of the questions are going to have the same point value. It's not going to be, you're not going to get a higher score the quicker you answer the question correctly. So, and everybody's going to have a minute to answer the question. And because I want to see how many of you have actually retained the information or at least took good notes. So you'll have a minute to answer each question. And if you get it right, you get the points. If you don't get it right, then you don't get the points. And that's how we're going to do it this upcoming Shabbat. But we'll do a review the night before on Shabbat Eve for the KABBALAT Shabbat service. All right, we're going to open up with prayer, and then we're going to get started with tonight's Bible study. Again, we're going to open up with prayer, and we'll get started with tonight's Bible study. If everybody could face Jerusalem, we will open up with prayer. All right, if everybody's facing Jerusalem, let's start. Abba Yah, thank you for this opportunity that you've allowed us to come together as Jews and Christians to study the Bible and to get a better understanding of the book of Genesis, and to grow closer to you, Elohim, to grow closer to both you, the Father, and Christ as well. We pray, Abba Yah, that the word that goes forth, that it'll fall on fertile ground where it'll be watered and nurtured and lead to fruits of repentance and works of righteousness, so that we can make the kingdom and make the first resurrection. We also pray, Abba Yah, El Elyon, the Most High God, that we do not add to your word and that we do not take away from your word, but that we teach your word, line upon line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little, there a little. And we ask that you would add a blessing to the reading, hearing, and doing of your word. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. All right. A couple of things real quick before we get started. One other thing I was going to mention. So after this Shabbat, right? So we're done with Genesis. We're going to be wrapping up the book of Genesis tonight. And then this Shabbat, we'll be doing a review and a quiz or exam in the form of Bible Jeopardy. After that, though, we're not going to move into the book of Exodus till after Passover, right? So for the month of Adar, because the new moon for Adar is next week. All right, so for the month of Adar, and for the first half of Abib, our Shabbat lessons are going to be on different subjects and topics. The sermons will be on different subjects and topics. And then we'll pick up with the book of Exodus after Passover. Because when we do Passover, during Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread, we're going to cover Exodus chapter 1 all the way up to like Exodus chapter 13, chapter 14 during Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so then when Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread is over, when we complete it, Pesach and Hajj HaMazat, we can then continue on with the rest of the book of Exodus, breaking it down chapter by chapter. Amen. All right, so that was just a heads up. One other thing I wanted to mention, I saw because I'm trying to really remove myself from the world right now here in this Daughter of Babylon. So I'm not paying attention to a lot of the stuff that's going on right now here in America. But I did see that they had some meeting at the Bible Museum in DC. And the meeting was supposed to be, it was like a meeting or one of those panel discussion things. And it was supposed to be about anti-Semitism and like what can be done to combat that and that type of stuff. But one of the people on there, and it was coming from like conservatives. One of the people though on the panel was some lady that was a former Miss California, and she's Catholic. And at the meeting, she voiced her disagreement with the Jews and she said that at this meeting, which was supposed to be against anti-Semitism, she took it upon herself to speak for all Roman Catholics. And she said Roman Catholics believe that the Jews killed Jesus, which is false. So I'll come back to that in a moment. And then she also said, as a Roman Catholic, we oppose Zionism. So I just want to be clear on some things. This is why the Roman Catholics are the enemy to Israelites. And it doesn't matter if you're the African Israelites or Ashkenazi, Sephardic. Roman Catholics are the enemy to all of us. I've been telling you that since we started the church and synagogue. When you hear the term in this country, like in America, Judeo-Christian, it doesn't include Roman Catholics. America was founded by Protestants. Protestants are an offshoot of Roman Catholics, but Protestants think, and they have a lot of things. They have a lot of holdover from Roman Catholics, but Protestants in their confusion, they actually think most Protestants, not most, all, unless they're even more confused, because that's where Protestant comes from, to protest against the Roman Catholics. All right. So when you hear that term Judeo-Christian, it doesn't include Roman Catholics, right? So anyways, just want to point out something, because when I saw that, it disturbed me. There's too much anti-Semitism going on right now. One, the literal definition of Zionism, or to be a Zionist, if you look it up in the dictionary, to be a Zionist or to believe in Zionism, all that means is that you believe or support that the Jews and the Israelites have right to the promised land and should be able to establish their own religious, political state in the promised land. So like in Palestine and where the land of Israel is now. That's all Zionist means. That's all Zionism means. So that's why you'll hear me in the lessons a lot when we're talking about HaMashiach at his second advent, establishing his kingdom here. I'll usually say, when HaMashiach comes to establish to put into effect the Zionist agenda, because when Christ comes back the Messiah, HaMashiach, the Christ, when he comes back at his second advent, that's what he's going to do. Okay, he's going to solidify that and create a permanent state of Israel where the Israelites, the Jews, will be residing there, and it's going to be a religious and political state, right? And it's going to be the state and nation that dominates the world during that time. This is all in your Bible, right? And this is why I've explained to y'all before, Roman Catholicism is a pagan European religion from the Roman Empire. It has nothing to do with the Bible. It has nothing to do with Jesus. And if you're saying, but I thought they followed you. No, all the Roman Empire did, because this is what Europeans have done all throughout their history. They steal and plunder and take from other cultures and civilizations and incorporate that into their beliefs, their culture, and then reappropriate it. Okay. So meaning they'll take other people's gods and cultures and then make them white and European looking. They did that with the Egyptians. They did that with the Mesopotamians. They did that with the Phoenicians. Okay. So the Greeks too, the Greco-Romans, right? So when the Greco-Romans did the same thing with the Hebrews religion, they took their God, their Messiah, and whitewashed it, literally made them into their image, and then incorporated them into their pantheon of gods. Okay. So if you look at the stuff that they actually do, it's just still their ancient pagan religion. They just incorporated the Hebrew deities into that and change things around to make it more palatable for the Europeans, right? But if you actually look at Roman Catholics, they don't believe in the Bible. That's what I'm saying. They don't believe in the Bible. That's not a part of their religion. They're not sola scriptura. Like in Latin, sola scriptura means, scripture alone. That's not their religion. They don't go off of sola scriptura. So the Bible is not what their religion is based off of. If their religion was based off of the Bible, they wouldn't be against Zionism. Also, that the lady who I'm mentioning, who was at this anti-Semitism thing, which was at the Museum of the Bible, she also falsely claimed that the Jews killed Jesus. We've been over this before. The Jews did not kill Jesus. The Bible tells you that Christ is the lamb that was slain from the foundation of the world. So if you want to point a finger at who killed Jesus, look at Adam. And we all descend from Adam. And Adam was the first man before there were any Jews even on the planet. So before there was Jacob, right? Adam and the sin, and Adam bringing sin into the world, that's what caused Christ to have to come and be crucified. So I don't ever want to hear any of y'all saying that ever. Like, oh, the Jews, right? Like we, the Jews, killed Jesus. If you're an actual ethnic Israelite, if you're spiritual Israel, if you're a convert and you're not an ethnic Israelite or mixed with that, right? I don't want to hear you saying that either. Like the Jews killed Jesus. That is scripturally on sound, meaning biblically on sound. Adam killed Jesus. Humanity, because of their sin, killed Jesus. Amen. Does this make sense? All right. So let's get started with tonight's lesson. We're just going to be wrapping up the book of Genesis. Bereishit, that's the Hebrew way of saying Genesis, right? Our beginnings. We're wrapping it up with the final chapter, chapter 50, and we're going to be dealing with, the deaths of Israel. That's Jacob and Joseph. The deaths of Israel and Joseph. If you see me taking any sips of my drink, this is sweet tea. It's Milo sweet tea from Alabama. It's not strong drink, right? So I'm not up here getting blitzed on strong drink. I'm just drinking sweet tea. All right. But before we jump into it, let's read Nehemiah 8 and 8 like we always do. Oh, and for the brothers in Kenya, the elders, we're going to try to send the funds to you tomorrow. So be looking for that, but we'll send you email. We'll send you an email, but we're going to try to send the funds to you tomorrow. All right. Nehemiah 8 and 8. So that being said, if anybody wants to contribute any extra for us to send, we're sending it tomorrow. We're sending it to Kenya tomorrow. So you still have opportunity. We'll do it sometime in the morning or afternoon tomorrow. Adonai Yira, if the Lord wills or provides. All right, Nehemiah 8 and 8. So they read in the book and the law of God distinctly and gave the sense and caused them to understand the reading. That's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to be in God's book. We're in the Torah, which is the law, right? The first 5 books of the Bible. We're in the book of Genesis, the first book, wrapping it up tonight. We're going to be reading the last chapter of Genesis distinctly, and we're going to help you make sense of and cause you to understand what we're reading here in the last chapter of the book of Genesis. All right, let's pull our notes up on the screen. And remember to take notes. I mentioned this before we did the prayer. With all these books that we're going to break down every book in the Bible. It's going to take some years, but we're doing it chapter by chapter. And in the middle of that, we're going to have like Bible Jeopardy, a midterm exam. And at the end of every book, we're going to have an end exam. Take notes, right? Because when we do the exam is going to be open book. Right. So make sure you have notes that you can refer back to. Okay. All right. So let's get an introduction first for Genesis chapter 50. All right. I took this from Kaufman's Bible commentary. I can put that over there until we get to the main notes. All right. So this is from Kaufman's Bible commentary. This chapter concludes the astounding book of Genesis, giving an account of the burial of Jacob and the death of Joseph. This chapter records one of the great actions of faith. Joseph was one of the most popular and successful prime ministers, if we may call him that. He was a vizier who ever lived. This man, Joseph, might indeed have been buried in one of the pyramids or have received the most elaborate and expensive burial that the wealth of Egypt could provide. But he renounced all of that and took a pledge of his brothers that when they went up out of Egypt into the land of God, into the land God had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they would also remember to carry his bones along with them and bury him in the land of Canaan. This must be reckoned among the great actions of faith in God. Genesis opened with "Let there be light." It ends with a mummy case in Egypt, right? So it ends with a mummy case in Egypt. And the Bible and the book of Genesis starts off with "Let there be light." Well, really, you have the primordial void after what you had the battle of the gods. That might be one of the questions that come up in the Jeopardy. But anyways, also in the first couple chapters, you have man being created, Adam, right? But then in the end, so the beginning of Genesis starts off with life, and the end of it is with someone in a coffin, Joseph. That's what we're going to have. That's what we're going to see tonight. But anyways, so continuing on here from Kaufman's Bible commentary, it says, where were we at? The mummy case. Oh, okay. But it ends with a mummy case in Egypt, but that very mummy case was a symbol of faith in the light of all nations, which in time should yet arise out of Israel and provide redemption for all in that one who is the light of the world. Okay. Now, furthermore, I have here in the introduction, this is from me. Immediately before dying, Israel gives his final mandates regarding his burial. He was to be buried in the family burial plot that the family owned, which Abraham had bought. Let me fix that typo. This is how you know these are my notes for the introduction. And that's how you know I don't use AI. All right. So immediately before dying, Israel gave his final mandates regarding his burial. He was to be buried in the family burial plot that the family owned, which Abraham had bought. He repeats this information twice, as if to make sure that his sons know that they are the legal owners of this piece of land. There he will rest in the company of 5 others he cared for: his grandparents, Abraham and Sarah, his parents, Isaac and Rebekah, and lastly, Leah, his primary wife. So he gets buried with Abraham and Abraham's wife, Sarah, which were his grandparents. He gets buried with Rebekah and Isaac, which were his parents. And then Jacob is buried there with Leah, his primary wife. After giving these mandates, Israel gave up the ghost, meaning Jacob died. Overcome with grief, Joseph threw himself upon his father and wept over him and kissed him, as would be expected due to his financial ability and social influence. Joseph took the lead in making the burial arrangements. This was also in accordance with Israel's wishes. Usually this responsibility falls upon the firstborn son, and since the birthright was given to Joseph, he's the one who did it. All right, now let's go to Genesis 50, and we're going to pick it up at verse 1. Genesis 50, and we're going to pick it up at verse 1. All right, it says here, and Joseph fell upon his father's face and wept upon him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. And the physicians embalmed Israel. And 40 days were fulfilled for him. For so are fulfilled the days of those which are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. All right, so let's read this again and break it down verse by verse. So verse 1, it says, and Joseph fell upon his father's face and wept upon him and kissed him. So I have here in the notes, Targum Jonathan, Targum Jerusalem, and Targum Neophyte all say that all of the 12 tribes were there. Keturah's offspring were also there. So, it was a family affair. Keturah became Abraham's wife after Sarah died, right? So think like the Midianites, Sheba, Dedan, Madon, right? Ishmael's offspring, it says, was also there, and Esau's offspring were all there. So 3 of the main targums, right, from New Testament times and the intertestamental period say that all of the sons of Jacob were there, all right, Cain when he died, but this is before he gets embalmed, and that they're cousins from Keturah, right? And then Ishmael's offspring as well, and Esau's offspring were all there. All right, now, verse 2. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel. Right, so I have here in the notes, ancient Kemet had the most advanced doctors in the world at this time. Right, so and that's who Joseph used to embalm Israel or embalm Jacob. Right, and it says here in verse 2, and Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel. Right, so I have here in the notes, ancient Kemet had the most advanced doctors in the world at this time. Right, verse 3. And 40 days were fulfilled for him, for so are fulfilled the days of those who are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. Right, so it was 40 days for him to be embalmed, and then an additional 30 days where they mourned for him. That makes 70 days total, or 70 days. All right, so I have here in the notes, Jacob's body was embalmed to preserve it. This was a lengthy process which accompanied the 70 days of mourning in Egypt. 40 days for embalming and 30 days of mourning as the mitzvah dictates, right? Mitzvah meaning commandment. That's a biblical commandment. It's a commandment in the Torah, right? That the time of mourning is 30 days, right? 30 days of mourning. Okay, we're going to read that in the scriptures in just a moment. So there were 40 days for him to be embalmed. Okay. And then after he was embalmed and the 40 days were complete, then they mourned for Jacob 30 days. Okay. 70 days is also how long it took the dead body to go through the whole mummification process beyond embalming. The mummification of Jacob and Joseph was no doubt a mark of their high standing in Egypt. Jacob is recorded in the ancient annals of Kemetic history as one of the pharaohs, thus why he is given a royal burial. Okay. And in the ancient records of Egypt, right, for ancient Egypt's records, Jacob is mentioned as one of the pharaohs because his son was a prince in Egypt, right? And he got this royal burial. And since he got this royal burial, he's actually listed in the king's list of Egypt. He's listed as Yaakov Har, right? Yaakov Har, right? And all Har means is mountain, right? Meaning mountain is lit. So Yaakov Har, and Har means mountain, is listed as one of the Asiatic pharaohs of Kemet during the 1700s BC. All right, so during the 1700s BC, we have a pharaoh listed in the king's list named Yaakov Har, right? And he's listed as one of the Asiatic kings or Asiatic pharaohs. Asiatic meaning Semitic, okay, meaning came from the other side of the Sinai, okay, coming from the Middle East. Also, other historical evidence, and we covered this. We talked about this a few weeks ago as we've been breaking down the book of Genesis. When you look at the history of Egypt, in the ancient history of Egypt, in the 1700s BC, you had many different pharaohs. You had like over 50 different pharaohs in the 1700s. But it was one vizier, right? One vizier or one prime minister during the bulk of that time. That confirms Joseph, right? So during that time, like even after this pharaoh, even after the pharaoh died from the famine, not from the famine, but during the time of the famine, Joseph remained vizier and a prince in Egypt or a prime minister in Egypt during that whole time. And when you look at the actual historical records for ancient Egypt during the 1700s, it's the 1700s BC. It's the vizier or prime minister that they say had the bulk of the power, because there was a lot of different changes in pharaohs during that time. But Joseph, or the prime minister, remained a constant. Okay, this is just extra learning on your way to learning. Let me flip the logo over. All right, now, just to show. And if you want to look up on your own the where Jacob is listed in ancient Kemet's pharaohs list, you would look up Yaakov Har. And that's the same way his name is in Hebrew too. I was going to show you that real quick. All right, Yaakov.
Strong's H 3290. Yaakov.
All right, let me go back to our notes. And so if you were looking him up in the ancient pharaohs list, that's how his name is listed in the ancient pharaohs list as well. All right, so let's read this again. Genesis 50 verses 1 through 3. And Joseph fell upon his father's face and wept upon him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. And the physicians embalmed Israel. And 40 days were fulfilled for him. For so are fulfilled the days of those which are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. All right, now I'm going to read from the General History of Africa, Volume 2, Ancient Civilizations of Africa. And I'm going to be reading from the section titled The Legacy of Pharaonic Egypt, pages 164 through 165. Give me just a moment. I want to put it in banner, and I'll put it in comments. All right. That's what we're going to be reading from. I'll put it back up in just a second. All right. I want to know if you can see. It's pretty faded. Nah, you can't see on the title there. But anyway, you should be able to see from the side. General History of Africa, Volume 2, Ancient Civilizations in Africa. And we're going to be reading from the section titled The Legacy of Pharaonic Egypt. And I'm reading from pages 164 through 165. And this is to help us understand what happened to Jacob during the embalming process and the history behind that. All right. Okay. Mummification. Or actually, I'll start up at scientific contributions here. Okay. Because remember, we just read here in Genesis chapter 50, where it said that Joseph commissioned the physicians, so that's the doctors and the scientists, to embalm Jacob, right? All right. So it says here, the pharaonic contribution to science and applied mathematics has left a valuable legacy in the fields of physics, chemistry, zoology, geology, medicine, pharmacology, geometry, and applied mathematics. In fact, and this is all before the Europeans even engaged in any of this stuff. This is before the Greeks, before the Romans, right? So originally it was the Africans, both Hamitic and Semitic, because the Hebrews were also involved in math and science, right? The originators of civilization were the Cushitic Assyrians, right? The Cushitic Assyrians, that's Mesopotamia, all right? The Phoenicians, right? That's the Canaanites from Ham. Kemet, ancient Egypt, all right, Nubia as well, right, our ancient Kush, ancient Ethiopia, the Israelites, okay, these are the original civilizations on the planet Earth, and they're the ones who created math, science, all of these things, okay. All right, now, way before the Europeans. All right. It says here, the pharaonic contribution to science and applied mathematics has left a valuable legacy in the fields of physics, chemistry, zoology, geology, medicine, pharmacology, geometry, and applied mathematics. In fact, they gave to humanity a large store of experience in each of these fields, some of which were combined in order to execute a specific project. Mummification. One outstanding example of the genius of the ancient Egyptians is mummification, right? And when it said here, when we read here in Genesis chapter 50, right, that the physicians embalmed Jacob, this is talking about they made Jacob they mummified him, right? So one outstanding example of the genius of the ancient Egyptians is mummification. It shows their mastery of a number of sciences, including physics, chemistry, medicine, and surgery. Their ability in each branch was an accumulation of long experience. For example, they exploited their discovery of the chemical characteristic of natron, which was found in certain areas of Egypt, particularly in the Wadi el Natrun, by using the chemical attributes of this substance for use in the practical fulfillment of the demands of their beliefs in the afterlife. For the ancient Egyptians believed in the continuity of life after death and emphasized this belief in a practical way by preserving the human body. The compounds, and I'll take this down so you can see, it's in the chat so you know what we're reading. All right, the compounds of natron have been analyzed in modern times as a mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, salt, and sodium sulfate. The ancient Egyptian, therefore, was aware of the chemical functions of these substances. In the process of mummification, he soaked the body in natron for 70 days. All right, this is why I mentioned earlier the embalming took 40 days, but the whole process of Jacob being mummified, right, took 70 days for the natron to do its work, right? So again, this is another way the Bible lines up with history. We're not reading the Bible right now. We're reading out of a history book, right? We're reading out of an academic book covering the history of ancient Egypt. And it says in here that it took 70 days for the whole process of mummification to be completed. And we just read in Genesis chapter 50, it was 70 days with Jacob. All right, now it says here, in the process of mummification, he soaked the body in natron for 70 days. He drew the brain out through the nostrils, and he also removed the intestines through an incision made in the side of the body. Such operations as these necessitated an accurate knowledge of anatomy, and the good state of preservation of the mummies illustrates the intimate knowledge. Surgery. It was undoubtedly the knowledge they acquired from mummification. All right, I'm reading this part about their surgeons because this is who Joseph used to embalm and mummify Jacob, right? It was the physicians, right? Meaning the surgeons and the scientists, the doctors, right? Surgery. It was undoubtedly the knowledge they acquired from mummification that enabled the Egyptians to develop surgical techniques at a very early period in their history. We have quite a good knowledge of Egyptian surgery. In fact, thanks to the Smith Papyrus, a copy of an original which was composed under the Old Kingdom between 2600 and 2400 BC. This papyrus is virtually a treatise on bone surgery and external pathology. 48 causes are examined systematically. In each case, the author of the treatises begins his account under a general heading, instructions concerning such and such a case, followed by a clinical description. If you observe such symptoms, the descriptions are always precise and incisive. They are followed by the diagnosis. You will say in this connection a case, this or that wound, and depending on the case, a case that I can treat or the case is without remedy. If the surgeon can treat the patient, the treatment to be administered is then described in detail. For example, the first day you will apply a bandage with a piece of meat. Afterwards, you will place 2 strips of cloth in such a way as to join the lips of the wound together. Several of the treatments indicated in the Smith Papyrus are still used today. Egyptian surgeons knew how to stitch up wounds and to set a fracture using wooden or pasteboard splints. And there were times when the surgeons simply advised that nature should be allowed to take its own course. In 2 instances, the Smith Papyrus instructs the patient to maintain his regular diet. Of the cases studied by the Smith Papyrus, the majority concern superficial lacerations of the skull or face. Others concern lesions of the bones or joints, such as contusions of the cervical or spinal vertebrae, dislocations, perforations of the skull or sternum, and sundry fractures affecting the nose, jaw, collarbone, humerus, ribs, skull, and vertebrae. So you see they had advanced medical knowledge in ancient Africa way before the Europeans. If you look at what the Europeans were doing when it comes to medicine and health, even like 500 years ago, it was savage. And what we're reading about here, this is over 4,000 years ago. What we're reading here, that they're talking about is found in this Smith papyrus. Okay, the Europeans in the 1500s were still leeching people and doing stupid stuff like put this mask on with and we put these flowers in there, and that's going to protect you from bubonic plague. All right. Anyways, I digress, but I don't digress. All right. It says here, and then other silly stuff like, you know, magic potions instead of actual science. All right. It says here, of the cases studied by the Smith. I know we read that part. Or we could go over. Of the cases studied by the Smith papyrus, the majority concern superficial lacerations of the skull or face. Others concern lesions of the bones or joints, such as contusions of the cervical or spinal vertebrae, dislocations, perforations of the skull or sternum, and sundry fractures affecting the nose, jaw, collarbone, humerus, ribs, skull, and vertebrae. Examination of mummies has revealed traces of surgery, right? And remember, Jacob was made a mummy, and we're going to read later in Genesis 50, Joseph is also going to be mummified, right? Examination of mummies has revealed traces of surgery, such as the jaw, dating from the Old Kingdom, which has 2 holes bored to drain an abscess, or the skull fractured by a blow from an axe or sword and successfully reset. All right, so they have examples of those types of surgeries. One, like if a man got hit in the head, but he didn't die from an axe or a sword, them successfully and his skull was fractured, them successfully resetting that man's skull. There is also evidence of dental work, such as filings done with a mineral cement. And one mummy had a kind of bridge of gold wire joining 2 shaky teeth. By its methodical approach, the Smith papyrus bears testimony to the skill of the surgeons of ancient Egypt. And again, we just read in Genesis chapter 50 that this is who Joseph commissioned to mummify Jacob. He commissioned the physicians, right? It says here, by its methodical approach, the Smith papyrus bears testimony to the skill of the surgeons of ancient Egypt. Skill which it would be fair to assume was handed on gradually in Africa as well as in Asia, right? And when it says Asia, it's talking about the Middle East. And so basically it's saying here that this advanced scientific knowledge, this advanced medical knowledge, right, and surgical knowledge spread from Egypt to the rest of Africa and spread also into the Middle East, right? It says here, by the doctors who were always attached to Egyptian expeditions to foreign lands. Moreover, it is known that foreign sovereigns like the Asian prince of Bactria, or Camses himself, brought in Egyptian doctors, right? Camses was Persian. Brought in Egyptian doctors. This is later in time. This is like Camses is over 1,000 years after Joseph, right? But it says himself brought in Egyptian doctors, that Hippocrates had access to the library of Imhotep's temple at Memphis, and that other Greek physicians later followed his example. This is what I was mentioning to you earlier about how the Greco-Romans, they just stole from African civilizations and incorporated that into their civilization, but then act like they came up with it when they didn't really come up with it. All right. Now, and also when it's talking here about Camses, like he was a Persian king, right? But his own Persian physicians, right, couldn't help him, right? He had to go and get Egyptian physicians to help him, African doctors, right? It says here, I'll read this again, Camses himself brought in Egyptian doctors, and that Hippocrates had access to the library of the Imhotep temple at Memphis, and that other Greek physicians later followed his example. All right, medicine. Medical knowledge can be considered as one of the most important early scientific contributions of the ancient Egyptian to the history of man. Documents show in detail the titles of Egyptian physicians and their different fields of specialization. Right? This is what we just read in Genesis 50 and verse 2, where it says Joseph commissioned the physicians, right, to embalm Jacob. Is everything okay? Because I like with the stream, because my thing went down from like 8 viewers to like 0. Are you able to still see me? Okay, maybe it's just, and the Rumble's okay too. All right, check Rumble. And I'm going to continue reading into 166. Let me know when you check Rumble. All right, I'll keep going. Maybe it's just something showing on, maybe it's just StreamYard tripping. All right, it says medical knowledge can be considered as one of the most important early scientific contributions of the ancient Egyptian to the history of man. Documents show in detail the titles of Egyptian physicians and their different fields of specialization. And again, as we were just reading in Genesis chapter 50 and verse 2, right? Joseph commissioned the physicians that were under him to embalm Jacob. Right? It says here, in fact, the civilizations of the ancient Near East and the classical world recognized the ability and reputation of the ancient Egyptians in medicine and pharmacology. One of the most significant personalities in the history of medicine is Imhotep, the vizier, architect, and physician of King Zoser of the Third Dynasty. His fame survived throughout Egyptian ancient history and through to Greek times. Deified by the Egyptians under the name of Imuthis, he was assimilated by the Greeks to Asclepius, the god of medicine. In fact, so that's what I was mentioning to you earlier with the Greco-Romans. They steal other people's culture and then make it their own and whitewash it. In fact, Egyptian influence on the Greek world in both medicine and pharmacology is easily recognizable in remedies and prescriptions. Some medical instruments used in surgical operations have been discovered during excavations. Written evidence of ancient Egyptian medicine comes in medical documents such as Eber's papyrus, the Berlin papyrus. And remember, Eber, that's where you get the name Hebrew from. The root of the word Hebrew goes back to Eber. The Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, and many others which illustrate the techniques of the operations and detail the prescribed cures. These texts are copies of originals dating back to the Old Kingdom, circa 2500 BC. In contrast to the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, which is highly scientific, and I might stop there. I'll read these last two. Despite this last two paragraphs, I'm on page 166. Despite this aspect common to other ancient civilizations as well, Egyptian medicine was not inconsiderable science, which contained the beginnings of a methodical approach, especially in the observation of symptoms. And this method doubtless passed to posterity by reason of its importance. The Egyptian doctor examined his patient and determined the symptoms of his complaint. He then made his diagnosis and prescribed treatment. All the extant texts describe this sequence, from which it may be concluded that it was standard procedure. The examination was made in 2 stages, some days apart if the case was unclear. Among the ailments identified and competently described and treated by Egyptian doctors were gastric disorders, stomach swelling, skin cancer, coryza, laryngitis, angina pectoris, diabetes, constipation, hemorrhoids, bronchitis, retention and incontinence of urine, bowhydria, ophthalmia, etc. The Egyptian doctor treated his patient using suppositories, ointments, serves, oils, massages, enemas, purges, poultices, and even inhalants whose use they taught to the Greeks. Their pharmacopoeia contained a large variety of medicinal herbs, the name of which unfortunately elude translation. Egyptian medical techniques and medicines enjoyed great prestige in antiquity, as we know from Herodotus. The names of nearly 100 ancient Egyptian physicians have been passed down to us through these texts, right? And some of these physicians might have been the ones who operated on Jacob's body, right, after he died. It says here, the names of nearly 100 ancient Egyptian physicians have been passed down to us through these texts. Among them are occultists and dentists, of whom Shacharit, who lived around 2600 BC under the 4th dynasty, could be considered as one of the most ancient. Among the specialists were also veterinarians. The physicians used a variety of instruments in their work. All right, now let's go back to our notes. So I was giving you some further context here for what we just read in verses 1 through 3. All right, and let's read it again. Genesis 50, verses 1 through 3. And Joseph fell upon his father's face and wept upon him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. And the physicians embalmed Israel. And 40 days were fulfilled for him, for so are the days of those which are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. So an additional 30 days, that made 70. 30 days is a time of mourning according to the Torah. Let's look at that. Numbers, especially for a great man. Let's go to Numbers 20 and verse 29. Numbers 20 and verse 29. And when all the congregation saw that Aaron was dead, they mourned for Aaron 30 days, even all the house of Israel. All right, so the Hebrews did not practice mummification. The Hebraic mitzvah for mourning is 30 days. So that's why in Genesis 50, you have the 40 days for embalming, right? Then you have the 30 days of mourning after, which gives you a total of 70 days. That's also how long it took the natron to complete its work, right, when in the mummification process, right? So let's read again Numbers 20 and verse 29. And when all the congregation saw that Aaron was dead, they mourned for Aaron 30 days, even all the house of Israel. All right, let's go to Deuteronomy 34, and we're going to look at verses 7 through 8. Deuteronomy 34, and we're going to look at verses 7 through 8. All right, Deuteronomy 34, and we're looking at verses 7 through 8. And Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. And the children of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. So the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. So again, 30 days. Now, let's go back to Genesis 50, and we're going to pick it up at verse 4. Genesis 50, and we'll pick it back up at verse 4. And when the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spake unto the house of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found grace in your eyes, speak, I pray you, in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, Lo, I die. In my grave which I have digged for me in the land of Canaan, there shalt thou bury me. Now therefore let me go up, I pray thee, and bury my father, and I will come again. And Pharaoh said, Go up and bury thy father, according as he made thee swear. And Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house and the elders of the land of Egypt. and all the house of Joseph and his brethren and his father's house, only their little ones and their flocks and their herds they left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. Okay, so I have here in the notes, Israel had made Joseph swear that he would be buried with his ancestors, and had repeated this instruction to all 12 tribes. I had a typo there. And I repeated this instruction to all 12 tribes. So Joseph informed Pharaoh of his oath and asked permission for leave of absence to go and bury his father. Permission was granted, as is the norm when one has a good relationship with one's superiors. Right? So you know how, like, when you're good at your job and you need to take time off and you're good at your job and your boss likes you, they don't have a problem giving you the time off, right? Because they want to retain you. So to them, it's like, what is it to me just to give you a few days off, right? So that you can go do something important, right? And I'd rather give you that time off than risk losing you. All right, let's go back to verse 4. We're going to read this again. I like to repeat reading things so it sticks in your mind, right? And we'll read the notes again. All right, Genesis 50, verses 4 through 9. And when the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spake unto the house of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found grace in your eyes, speak, I pray you, in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, Lo, I die. In my grave which I have digged for me in the land of Canaan, there shalt thou bury me. Now, therefore, let me go up, I pray thee, and bury my father, and I will come again. And Pharaoh said, Go up and bury thy father, according as he made thee swear. And Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and the elders of the land of Egypt. All the house of Joseph and his brethren and his father's house, only their little ones and their flocks and their herds they left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. So Joseph had a military escort as well from Egypt come with him to go bury his father in the land of Canaan. So again, I have here in the notes, Israel had made Joseph swear that he would be buried with his ancestors, and had repeated this instruction to all 12 tribes. So Joseph informed Pharaoh of his oath and asked permission for leave of absence to go and bury his father. Permission was granted, as is the norm when one has good relationships with one's superiors. All right, I also have here in the notes, Solomon spoke of Israel's burial, or Jacob's burial, in Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon. Remember, the Lord's vineyard is Jacob, or Israel. All right, let's go to Song of Solomon, chapter 1, and we're going to read verses 6 through 9. Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. And we're going to see here that Solomon spoke about Israel, or Jacob's burial, in Song of Songs. All right, and remember, the Lord's vineyard is Jacob, or Israel. So Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. Look not upon me because I am black, because the sun have looked upon me. My mother's children were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard have I not kept. All right. This is Yah HaMashiach talking. Yeshua HaMashiach, Yah HaMashiach. Right. One of the two Yahwehs, and specifically which of the two Yahwehs is this talking? Is Christ talking. All right. This is pre-incarnate Christ here talking, and here in the Song of Solomon, right? And he's saying, I am black, right? Because that's his skin color, right? He wasn't, Jesus, when he came in a flesh and blood body, did not come as a white man, okay? The Bible tells you this over and over and over, okay? And when it says here, his vineyard is Israel. So if you don't have that, if you don't have this notated here in your scripture, right, that this is Jesus talking, right? And Jesus is the one talking, and his beloved is Israel, his people, right? The whole book of the Song of Solomon is a love story, right? An allegory or a metaphor for Jesus's love towards the Israelites, right? Jesus's love toward his people. the Jews, the Israelites, the Hebrew Israelites, right? Now, let's read this again, verse 6. Look not upon me because I am black, because the sun have looked upon me. My mother's children were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard have I not kept. Tell me, O thou whom my soul loveth, where thou feedest. And that, for a quick reference, that's what I was mentioning earlier tonight as well, and I keep bringing it up, how the Europeans steal other people's civilization, steal other people's culture, and then whitewash it. That's the same thing they did with Jesus. We read earlier tonight when we were just reading in the book, The General History of Africa, Ancient Civilizations of Africa. When we were reading in that, it talked about how the Greeks took Imhotep and made Imhotep one of their Greek gods and whitewashed him. Right? They're not going to show him. They're not going to show him as, black or African looking. They try to make all of them. They try to make him look white, even though he was Egyptian. That's the same thing they did with Jesus. All right. Now, and this isn't the only place where it tells you this. In the book of Daniel, it tells you that Yahamashiach is a black man. He's bronze, brown, dark brown. Right? I digress, but I don't digress. Now, let's pick it back up here. Let's pick it back up here at verse 7. Tell me, O thou whom my soul loveth, where thou feedest, where thou makest thy flock to rest at noon. For why should I be as one that turneth aside by the flocks of thy companions? If thou know not, O thou fairest among women, he's talking about the children of Israel, go thy way forth by the footsteps of the flock, and feed thy kids beside the shepherd's tent. I have compared thee, O my love, right? And who is he talking about here as his love, right? His vineyard, the children of Israel, right? I have compared thee, O my love, to a company of horses in Pharaoh's chariots, right? So he's comparing Israel or Jacob here to a company of horses in Pharaoh's chariots. When did that happen? Right? What we just read in Genesis 50 after Jacob's death, right? It was a great company of chariots and horses, a military escort that accompanied Joseph, right, and the 12 tribes as they went to the land of Canaan to bury Jacob. All right. Now, for historical context, the Canaanites during this time were a tributary state to Egypt, but they have been rebelling. And that rebellion is going to culminate after Joseph dies with the Hyksos during the second intermediate period. This is extra learning on your way to learning. So that's another reason why they would have sent with Joseph a military escort to make sure that the Canaanites didn't try to attack them. All right. Because during this time, you had a lot of rebellion with the Canaanites, and the Egyptians were ruling. To put this in ways you can understand in today's terms, like Egypt would be like America, and Canaan would be like Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa. It would be like that. If you live here in America, that'll help you understand. All right, now let's go to Isaiah chapter 5, and we're going to look at verses 1 and 7. This is just to show you that what we read here in Song of Solomon was Yahweh talking about the Israelites, right? The Israelites are Jacob. That's his vineyard. Jacob and Jacob's offspring. That's the vineyard of the Lord, the well-beloved. All right, Isaiah 5. And we're going to look at verses 1 and 7. Oh, so in your notes, in your Bible, notate there in Song of Solomon chapter 1 and verse 9 that this is referring to what we just read in Genesis chapter 50 and verse 9. So in Song of Solomon chapter 1 verse 9, make a note next to verse 9 to reference Genesis chapter 50 and verse 9. Okay? All right, now I'll give y'all a second to do that, and then y'all can turn to Isaiah chapter 5. All right, Isaiah chapter 5, and we're going to read verse 1 and verse 7. Now, while I sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My well-beloved hath a vineyard and a very fruitful hill. Notice here, this is the same language you find in the Song of Solomon, right? We're talking about his beloved, his vineyard. Who is this vineyard? Line upon line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little, there a little. Skip to verse 7. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his pleasant plant. And he looked for judgment, but behold, oppression, for righteousness, but behold, a cry. All right, now, let's go back to Genesis 50, and we're going to pick it up at verse 10. Let's go back to Genesis 50, and we're going to pick it up at verse 10. All right, Genesis 50, and we're reading verses 10 through 11. Excuse me. All right, and if anybody came late, I mentioned earlier, I'm just drinking sweet tea. It's Milo sweet tea. It's not strong drink. All right. It says, and they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond Jordan. And there they mourned with a great and very sore lamentation. Notice there it says they went to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond Jordan. So this means they took the long way around to get into Canaan, right, where they were going to bury Jacob. They took the long way around and came in through the back way. All right, it says, and they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond Jordan, and there they mourned with a great and very sore lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, right, so the Phoenicians, saw the mourning in the floor of Atad, they said, this is a grievous mourning to the Egyptians. Wherefore the name of it was called Abel Mizraim, which is beyond Jordan. So notice the Canaanites are the Phoenicians. When they saw the Israelites coming, right, because the 12 tribes came with their families, they only left the little kids in Goshen. That should let you know something. You don't always have to force your little kids to go to a funeral. You know, they didn't bring the little ones. They didn't bring the littlest ones with them going to Jacob's funeral. Right. So you don't always have to do that. Sometimes kids don't understand what's going on. Right. But anyways, this is just extra. That's just extra learning on your way. That's just extra learning on your way to learning. All right. Now, notice here, though, the Phoenicians are the Canaanites. When they saw the children of Israel, right, with this great company of Egyptians, they couldn't tell the difference between the Israelites and the Egyptians. Right. This means that the Israelites and the Egyptians looked similar. When we're saying look similar, meaning physical attributes. Right. So the ancient Israelites looked similar to Africans. Okay. Now, let's read this again. Verses 10 through 11. And they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond Jordan, and there they mourned with a great and very sore lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning in the floor of Atad, they said, this is a grievous mourning to the Egyptians. Wherefore the name of it was called Abel Mizraim, which is beyond Jordan. So I have here in the notes, Jacob had an impressive funeral procession attended by all Pharaoh's officials, as well as a military escort. All the members of Jacob's household were there too, except their little children. And remember, so Jacob goes down in the annals of ancient Kemet as a pharaoh in the pharaoh list because he got this royal burial. Joseph was prime minister for a couple generations in Egypt, vizier for a couple generations in Egypt. Okay. Prior to Jacob, though, Jacob's grandfather, Abraham, he lived and dwelt in Pharaoh's court for a little while. We read about that in Genesis chapter 12. Okay. So the history of the Israelites is intertwined with the history of ancient Egypt. Like the history of the ancient Israelites is intertwined with the history of ancient Egypt. Okay. ancient Africa. Now, I have here in the notes, Jacob had an impressive funeral procession attended by all Pharaoh's officials, as well as a military escort. All the members of Jacob's household were there too, except their little children. In summary, and just in case there's any new people, right? Bantu. So this ties into a lot of different peoples, like their original ancient Egyptians from Africa. The original ancient Egyptians were Nilotic peoples. Okay. But your Bantus and your like West Africans, not all of them, but a lot of them from the Niger branch of the Niger Bantu peoples, they came from, if you look at their ancient histories, right, they come from the Israelites, and all these groups like the Bantu and the Niger branch, 99.9% of them all say that they originated in Egypt and in Palestine and migrated from Palestine or Israel and from Egypt into Central Africa, Eastern Africa, Western Africa, Southern Africa, right? So if you are of Afro-Latino descent fully or partially, if you're of Caribbean descent and you're not like, from, the East Indies, if you're like Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latino, African-American, either fully or partially, right? The groups that were brought over here as slaves, they descend from, and indentured servants, they descend from these peoples, okay? Notice here, everything we're reading about in the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible, we've been only in Africa and the Middle East, okay? All right, and when you look at like the Bantu peoples say they originated in Israel and in Egypt and migrated from there down into the other parts of Africa. Okay, so if you're of Afro-Latino descent, Afro-Caribbean, African-American, we're reading now about your ancient history. Right? I don't even like the concept of Black History Month. For a variety of reasons. I don't like the term Black. That's not tied to anything. It should be African American History Month. And then at this point, we got so many of our brothers and sisters from other parts of the diaspora living here too, right? It should incorporate everybody. Another reason I don't like it is you shouldn't make it just 1 month. And another reason I don't like it is because once you open a door to give a special month to one group, it opens up the door for all these other groups. And now we have LGBTQI History Month and all this nonsense, right? You should be learning about your culture's history all the year long, right? Not just for 1 month. And also, you shouldn't be having to go to Babylon to learn your history during some month they gave you. You should be learning your history from your parents. Your parents should be the ones teaching you your history. And your church, your temple, your synagogue, they should be teaching you your history. And that's what we're doing here. Another reason I don't like Black History Month is because the bulk of the stuff they deal with during Black History Month is slavery, right? And the civil rights movement. There's way more to our history than slavery here in America for a couple hundred years and the civil rights movement, right? During Black History Month, they don't talk about this. They don't talk about our ancient history going back to biblical times. So right now, you're learning about our ancient history, okay? And for our brothers and sisters on the continent, you're learning it too, right? But I'm focusing here on those of us in the diaspora. You're learning about your ancient history, right? If you have children, make sure they should know more about this, right? And their ancient history. Okay. And not even going beyond biblical times, going and the rest of ancient times, going into medieval times. They should know more about that than knowing about the civil rights movement and slavery, right? Because they should know more about the positive from their history than a few hundred years of being slaves. All right. Now, back here in the notes, because I just wanted to get that in. I went make sure we understand that. All right, so we'll repeat this. Jacob had an impressive funeral procession attended by all Pharaoh's officials, as well as a military escort. All the members of Jacob's household were there too, except their little children. In summary, it was a very large company. In fact, it was so large and intimidating that the Phoenicians who witnessed the 7 days of mourning in Canaan actually recorded it in the name of that place. They called it Abel Mizraim, which means mourning of the Egyptians. All right. When it said here in verse 10, and they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond Jordan. Right. When it says which is beyond Jordan, meaning they traveled around the back end, going this. I'm fixing my type up. All right. So when it says which is beyond Jordan, meaning they traveled around the back end, going this way allowed them to go through northern Arabia. So the Arabs, right, the Ishmaelites and the Midianites, etc., and the Edomites could pay their respects. Then entering Jordan, where the Moabites and Ammonites could pay their respects as well, right? Because remember, the Moabites and the Ammonites descend from Abraham's nephew, okay? And Abraham was Jacob's grandfather. And then the Edomites come from Jacob's twin brother, okay? And then the Ishmaelites, the Arabs, they come from Jacob's uncle, okay? And then the Midianites, etc., meaning the offspring of Keturah, right? That's the same thing as Ishmael. That those were his uncle's families. Okay. So going this way, like taking the long way, going through the back end to enter into Canaan, to bury from coming in from the other side of the Jordan, right? This allowed all of the other Hebraic groups to also see Jacob's procession, right? And participate in the funerary procession. Okay. All right. Now, also, it's a foreshadowing to how Jacob's children, like 4 generations later, were going to enter into the promised land because they came in through the back end. All right. Now, just extra learning on your way to learning. So I have here, which is beyond Jordan, meaning they traveled around the back end. Going this way allowed them to go through northern Arabia. So the Arabs, right, Ishmaelites, Midianites, etc., and Edomites could pay their respects. Then entering Jordan, give me just a moment. Getting a little warm. Get my fan. Right. So then entering Jordan, talking about where the modern day country of Jordan is, where the Moabites and Ammonites could pay their respects, right? So all the Hebraic groups. It also foreshadows how the Israelites will later enter the promised land after the Exodus, right? Lastly, I have here in the notes, the Phoenicians could not tell the difference between the ethnicity of the Egyptians and the Hebrews, right? Specifically the Israelites. The ancient Israelites resembled Africans. Even in New Testament times, they were said to look like Africans. All right, let's go to Exodus chapter 2, and we're going to read verses 15 through 19. Exodus chapter 2, and we're going to read verses 15 through 19. Okay? And notice when this is Moses now, right? And he's in the land of Midian, and they're going to mistake him for an Egyptian, right? And this isn't because he had Egyptian clothes and Egyptian ways. So, for example, if I saw a Polish man in a dashiki and wearing a kufi, I'm not going. If I saw a Polish looking man, right? So if I saw like a Janikowski, right, or a Polak, okay, and they're wearing a dashiki and a kufi, I'm not going to mistake them for a Nigerian. I'm not going to think, oh, there goes a Nigerian. even though they're wearing Nigerian type clothes. Okay, I wouldn't think that because their physical attributes don't match what a Nigerian looks like. Okay, so here when we read this passage in Exodus chapter 2, when they mistake Moses for an Egyptian, right? Even though Moses is a Hebrew like them, the Midianites are Hebrews too, just a different branch, right? Israelites are Hebrews, Ishmaelites are Arabs are Hebrews, Edomites are Hebrews, right? Moabites are Hebrews. According to the Bible, anybody who descends from Eber, from Genesis chapter 10, right? Anybody who descends from Eber is a Hebrew. That's where the word Hebrew comes from. All right. So, anyways, they thought, oh, this is an Egyptian, right? Because not only most of the Hebrews look like that too, right? But he had on Egyptian type attire, Egyptian types of clothes. And because of that, right, and him looking like the Egyptians, they're like, oh, this must be an Egyptian. Okay. Again, showing you that the Israelites looked like Africans, right? The biblical Israelites looked like Africans. All right, now, excuse me. So the people of the book look like Africans. Exodus 2, verses 15 through 19. Now, when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. And when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, how is it that you are come so soon today? And they said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and also drew water enough for us and watered the flock. So notice Moses looked like an Egyptian. All right, let's go to Acts chapter 21, and we're going to read verses 37 through 39. And here in Acts chapter 21, we have the Apostle Paul being described as looking like an Egyptian. Okay. I think, do I have a picture of that? Yeah, I'm gonna pull. I was seeing if I had an old picture of them having. I'm seeing if I want to pull up these other pictures. I might. I'll keep that up to the side. I might look at those too. All right. So let's look at Acts 21, verses 37 through 39. And what you're going to see here is just like how the Phoenicians in Genesis chapter 50 couldn't tell the difference between the Hebrews and the Egyptians, talking about skin tone, physical attributes, right? Facial features. They couldn't tell the difference between them and Northern Africans, Eastern Africans. Even in New Testament times, people couldn't tell the difference, right? You're going to see this here, this being demonstrated with the Apostle Paul, who came from the tribe of Benjamin, right? Acts chapter 21, verses 37 through 39. And as Paul was to be led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, may I speak unto thee? Who said, canst thou speak Greek? Art thou not that Egyptian, which before these days made us an uproar and led us out into the wilderness, 4,000 men that were murderers? But Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Sicilia, a citizen of no mean city, meaning not like Memphis, and beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. So notice here, they thought the Roman authorities thought he was an Egyptian, right? That Paul looked like an African. And then when he started speaking Greek, they're like, what? And he's like, man, I'm a Jew, but they thought he was just another African, another Egyptian, because that's what they look like. All right. Now, just to show you, I'm going to show you some images of what the ancient Egyptians look like. So I'll show you what they look like in ancient times. And then I'm going to show you Old Testament times. And then if time permits, I'll show you, I don't want to make this lesson longer than it needs to be. I'll show you what they look like, what the Egyptians look like in New Testament times, the ones who were still the ones who came from the original ancient Egyptians, not the Greek interlopers and not the Greek and Latin. And when I'm saying Latin, I mean Roman. So not the Greek and Roman and Persian interlopers. All right. This is, I'm going to put it up on the screen so you'll see it anyway. Give me a moment. All right. So this is from this book. I'm going to show you some pictures out of this. Art and History of Egypt. "5,000 Years of Civilization." Even here on the back, you can see, you're able to see the pictures, right? All right, notice its skin tone. That the person's skin tone up there right here where my finger is, his skin tone is the same as mine. All right, look at these people's skin tone. Sorry if the lights, look at these people's skin tone. Again, this is the book we're looking at. Let's show you how they depicted their gods. All either brown, bronze, or jet black, or blue black. You see that? Can you see it? All right. And again, this is how the Israelites were described as looking in the Bible, and by the people who were around them. Can y'all see that? Are you able to see it? You can see their skin tone. And I'm just showing you this out of actual books because the white man will lie to you. Europeans will try to tell you, oh, the Egyptians, they weren't black, they weren't brown, they were really white people. No, they weren't, dude. All right. That's why I have all these books dealing with ancient Egypt that has actual depictions of them. Some more. Let's see if y'all are able to see. I'll get a couple more out of here. And for time's sake, I'll only show these ones. I won't pull up the more modern ones. No. Now I'll do one more. You see the type of hair they got? It's braids. Like the type of braids we do. Nah, I'll be nice. They are nylotic. How about that? It's one on here. I'm like, that's a typical nylotic skull feature. All right. Let's see. There's another one. All right, I'll stop there. But this book, I'll show one more. I'll show one more. This one. And again, because this book is art and history of Egypt, 5,000 years of civilization, right? And so most of it is just the artwork the Egyptians did of themselves. I'll stop there. This book's filled with the stuff. Let me find one of because they have pictures of Egypt today, like people in Egypt today. And again, they're not white. Right? This is Egypt today. I don't know if you can see those people. You see them? All right, they're not white, right? All right. Maybe I'll do this with these sisters down here. Hold on. Trying to get a good one. That's the last one. Yeah. All right. Put our notes back up on the screen. I was going to show, I have some slides where it shows you what people in Egypt look like during Paul's time. And they actually during Paul, because they have paintings and depictions of Egyptians from New Testament times. And when they differentiate between the ones who are like Greco-Roman, meaning like the Greek and Roman interlopers, and the ones who were actual descendants from the ancient Egyptians. Right? And even in New Testament times, the ones who came from the actual ancient Egyptians were brown. And the Hebrews, right? The Hebrews that were living in Egypt during that time, they were brown. All right, hold on. I might put it up. I'll do that one. So real quick. I'll move myself to. So this picture, and I'm going to remove myself in just a moment so you can see it. All right, this is a depiction. This is a depiction of the Hebrews crossing the Red Sea with Moses and Aaron, right, during the Exodus. And this was taken from the wall of Dura Europos synagogue circa 200 AD. So this painting goes back to 200 AD, right? And it's near, and it goes, and the Dura Europa synagogue is near the border of Syria and Iraq. And this painting goes back to 200 AD, right? So right after New Testament times. Look how they have Moses and Aaron depicted. All right, so that's enough of that. So let's go back to our notes for this lesson. All right, let's go back to Genesis 50, and we're going to pick it up at verse 12. Genesis 50, and we're going to pick it up at verse 12. All right, it says here, and his sons did unto him according as he commanded them. For his sons carried him into the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, which Abraham bought with the field, for a possession of a burying place of Ephron the Hittite before Mamre. And when Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, they said, Joseph will peradventure hate us, and will certainly requite us all the evil which we did unto him. All right, so I have here in the notes, having fulfilled their father's wish, Joseph returned to Egypt together with his brothers and the others who had gone with him to bury his father. After the burial of a dear one, life must continue on, right? He was buried in the cave of the patriarchs. So again, having fulfilled their father's wish, Joseph and his brethren returned back to Egypt, returned back to Africa, right? And after burying their father, because, after the funeral is over, life has to go back to normal, right? And Jacob was buried there in the cave of the patriarchs. All right, let's pick it back up here at verse 15. And when Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, they said, Joseph will peradventure hate us, and will certainly requite us all the evil which we did unto him. And they sent a messenger unto Joseph, saying, Thy father did command before he died, saying, So shall ye say unto Joseph, Forgive, I pray thee now, the trespass of thy brethren and their sin, for they did unto thee evil. And now we pray thee, forgive the trespass of thy servants, and forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of thy father. And Joseph wept when they spake unto him. All right, so I have here in the notes 3 Targums, and it's the same ones from before, 3 of the 4 ancient Targums, right? Neophyte, Jonathan, and Jerusalem. The Jerusalem Targum, the Neophyte Targum, the Jonathan Targum, all of them except for Onklios, which is the Greek one, right? So all of the Aramaic ones, right? The Semitic ones, the Hebrew ones, right? They all 3 of them say that the messenger that was sent was Bilhah, right? So 3 Targums state that Bilhah, and so these are ancient records, ancient documents, right? You can notate that. You can notate that there in what verse is this? 16, when it says messenger, that's probably talking about Bilhah, like that they sent Bilhah. 3 Targums state that Bilhah, Rachel's handmaid, who was like a second mother to Joseph, was the messenger. All right, because remember, Bilhah was Rachel's handmaid, and Rachel was Joseph's mother. All right, so again, 3 Targums, 3 of the ancient Targums state that Bilhah, Rachel's handmaid. So if you have 3 of them from the ancient one, and because there's 4 of them from the ancient, from when I'm saying ancient, from the intertestamental period and like New Testament times, you have 3 out of the 4, and the 3 out of the 4 that confirm it are the ones that were the Targums in Aramaic, right? Then it's probably true because you have 3 confirmations. I look at the Targums all the time, and when it's something like unbelievable, right, then it's usually only one of them that states that, and the one that's the most unbelievable all the time is Jonathan. Like that's the one that's usually got something unbelievable. Or like, for example, I got one. So this is something I didn't put in here. I didn't put this in our notes because only one Targum states this, and it's the one that's always has the most fantastical stories. But in Targum Jonathan, it says that Dan, the son of one of Dan's sons, I believe it's Dan, if I remember correctly, one of Dan's sons kills Esau by chopping off Esau's head because Esau tried to block Jacob from being buried in the cave of the patriarchs. And like when he chopped off Esau's head, his head rolled into the cave and rested on Isaac's bosom. So anyways, I didn't put that. This is just showing you why I was saying to you, I would mark down that it's Bilhah, because we have 3 of them confirming that, right? When it's something where it seems too good to be true and it's only one of them saying it, and this is just giving you extra learning on your way to learning, understanding the Targums. The four reliable Targums are Jonathan, Jerusalem, Neophyte, and Onklios. The one that normally has the most, like, where it says something that might seem like, oh, I don't know about that, and it's the only one that says that, is usually Jonathan, right? But if you have all 3 or all 4 of them saying the same thing, then that's an actual record. Because remember, the Targums, we've explained this before, but I'll go over it again. The Targums is what was used in the synagogues in the intertestamental period and in New Testament times. When they would get up to read the Torah on the Sabbath. So you know how Brother Daryl does the weekly, I'm going to pull it up, because I don't want to mispronounce it. I can't remember everything in Hebrew, although I'm remembering a lot of stuff. I think it's HaShavua. I should have just said it. All right, the Parashat HaShavua, right? So when he does that every week, that's the same thing they were doing in ancient times. They had that weekly Torah reading, and they kept a schedule, right, at the synagogues. And this is why in the book of Acts, I believe it's chapter, is it 16? Or is it 15? I don't want to I want to get things exactly right. So give me just a moment. I think it's 15. It's 15. So in Acts chapter 15, when it mentioned if they want to learn more about Moses, right, talking about the Gentiles, they were like, they can go to the synagogue and Moses is read every Sabbath. That was referring to that weekly Torah schedule that they kept. When they would get up and read the Torah, they would read it in Hebrew. But the majority of the Israelites didn't know Hebrew at that time throughout the diaspora. So after they would read it in Hebrew, they would do a targum. A targum just means a translation. And when they would translate it, they would further explain what they read. All right. Targum Neophyte, Targum Jerusalem, Targum Jonathan. That's the Aramaic one, right? Where they would do it, where they would then translate it and expound upon it in Aramaic. Onklios is when they would do it in Greek, right? The Greek one. Okay. So anyways, this is just extra learning on your way to learning. All right, now, and in the New Testament, the disciples, when they would go into the synagogue and read from the Torah, we read about this in the book of Acts, they would have done the same thing because the people wouldn't have known. The majority of the Israelites, the majority of the Jews weren't able to understand Hebrew anymore, right? Because of the diaspora, right? It tells you this in the scriptures. So when they would go into the synagogue and read afterwards, then they would explain and expound upon it using the Targum, right? Either in Aramaic or in Greek to the people, depending on where they were at. Right? This is just extra learning on your way to learning. So 3 of those Targum of the ancient Targums say Bilhah. So it's more than likely Bilhah. And that also makes sense because Bilhah was Rachel's handmaid, right? And Rachel was Joseph's mother. Right. So I have here 3 Targums state that Bilhah, Rachel's handmaid, who was like a second mother to Joseph, was the messenger. We can see here that Jacob became a better father later in life. Because remember, as we've been reading about Jacob as a father and husband, at first he wasn't that great of a father and husband. but we see that he got better later in life, because right before he died, he instructed his sons, right, to do right towards Joseph, and for Joseph to forgive them. So this kind of shows you that Jacob got away from showing that favoritism Jacob got away from that bad favoritism of Joseph, right? By telling Joseph, forgive your brothers, right, for the evil they did towards you. Okay. All right. But I have here in the notes, where are we at? We can see here that Jacob became a better father later in life, telling his sons to go and seek forgiveness from the son they had wronged. The only one innocent was Benjamin, right? His only brother from the same mother. So, because remember, Benjamin wasn't even alive yet at the time, at that time that happened. Let me go back and see. Or if he was just young, super young. Give me just a moment. No, so he was still young when that happened to Joseph. He was already born in chapter 35, and it happened to Joseph in chapter 37. So Benjamin was really young, still like a lad when that happened to Joseph, when his brothers, threw him into the pit and then had him sold into slavery. All right. So Benjamin had nothing to do with that. Benjamin, though, is his full sibling. They have the same father and the same mother, right? The reason why I'm pointing this out is because you have to work on that if you end up having kids and, y'all don't share the same, you got the same dad, but you don't share the same mom. You got the same mom, but you don't share the same dad. You're going to have to cultivate unity amongst them. And you can't show favoritism. That's what Jacob did at first, and it caused animosity between the siblings, right? Now, so the only one that was innocent was Benjamin, his only brother from the same mother. The rest have different mothers. Once the common denominator died, Jacob, they were fearful, right? So once their father died, they were fearful. This is why Jacob should have stayed married to Leah only, right? We talked about that before as we've been breaking down the book of Genesis. They suspected, right, meaning Joseph and Benjamin's other brothers, right? Their brothers from other mothers, right? They suspected that it was only Jacob's presence that kept Joseph from taking further retribution. Their attitude reminds us of the importance of parents. Many homes disintegrate when one or both parents die, simply because only the presence of the parents kept the family together, right? So again, keep that in mind too. Sometimes if you don't do things right, when you die as the parent, the family could fall apart because the parent was the only one keeping that common denominator. Parent was the only one keeping the family together. Okay. And so this is what Joseph and Benjamin's other brothers were thinking. They're thinking, all right, Jacob's died. All right, we all have the same father, but we got different mothers. When the common denominator dies, Jacob, right, then Joseph might turn on us. That's what they're thinking. All right, so I have here in the note. Does this make sense? All right, so I have here in the notes, many homes disintegrate when one or both parents die simply because only the presence of the parents kept the family together. It is unfortunate that the brothers waited at least 17 years before formally asking Joseph for forgiveness. Joseph did not forgive them because their trespass was intentional. He showed them mercy. He had already gotten retribution earlier when they first came to Egypt seeking food. All right, if you notice here, we don't read anywhere here where it says he forgave them. Okay, we don't read anywhere here where it says he forgave them. All he did was show them mercy, right? And he had already got his retribution on them, right? When they came into Egypt seeking food, when he tricked them and made them think and held one of them back and made them think that they were going to end up being killed for stealing from, the Egyptians, right? So he had already gotten his retribution back on them. Okay. All right. You remember we covered that months ago when we were in that section of Genesis. So he had already gotten his retribution on them. Right? He didn't forgive them because what they did was intentional. And the Bible says you don't forgive intentional sin. Okay? If the sin is intentional, there is no forgiveness for that. Forgiveness only applies to unintentional sin and unintentional trespass. If they didn't intentionally trespass against you, then you forgive them. If they intentionally trespassed against you, then you can show them mercy, right? If you want to, okay? But you can't forgive them, not biblically, because the Torah is very clear on this. It's the mitzvah. You do not forgive intentional sin. So I just want to point that out here. We're going to keep reading, right, up to verse 21, but you're not going to read where it says Joseph actually forgive them, right? Joseph says to them, am I God? Meaning like, I'm not God. I can't forgive you like that. You intentionally trespass, right? So just keep that in mind as well. And just as a reminder, Joseph had already gotten his get back on them. So if Joseph would have went any further here, he would have been furthering the affliction. And that's when it would have been, we did a lesson on this too, I thought. Let me go back and find it. We talked about retribution. He had a law of retribution. Genesis chapter 31. When we went over Genesis chapter 31, because Jacob got retribution on Laban. And so that's where that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth comes from, right? But anyways, I digress, but I don't digress. So Joseph had already gotten his retribution on them. If he would have further afflicted them after Jacob died, then he would have been in sin. He would have went beyond what was legitimate retribution. Okay. This is just extra learning on your way to learning. All right. Let's pick it back up here at verse 18. And his brethren also went and fell down before his face. And they said, behold, we be thy servants. And Joseph said unto them, fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. Now, therefore, fear ye not, I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spake kindly unto them. So notice here, we did not read where it said he forgave them, right? He just showed mercy upon them, right? And to be clear, he had already gotten his get back, his retribution, right? Because again, when they sold him into slavery and threw him into that pit, because originally they were going to kill him, they did that intentionally. They came up with a plan. They thought that out, right? It was not an accident. Okay. An accident would have been Joseph fell into a pit while they were traveling and they didn't know he fell into a pit. And then when it was later in the day, they realized, where's Joseph? And oh, Joseph's not with us. And it's like, well, maybe he fell into that pit, or we heard he fell into a pit. And then some Arabs came and just took him out the pit without them knowing, right? That would have been a trespass that could be forgiven because it wasn't intentional, right? And since he was the youngest one there, right, he was under their care, right? So I'm just giving you an example of where it could have been forgiven if it was unintentional, right? But it wasn't unintentional, it was intentional. They concocted the plan to have him sold into slavery. Amen. Does this make sense? All right, I'm just making sure what we're dealing with here, Mick. I don't want anybody being boo-boo the fool, like like a Roman Catholic or a Sunday Christian. The ones oh, he raped my mom and he killed my mom and then raped her, had sex with her dead corpse. But because I'm a Christian, I'm gonna forgive him because that's what God would want me to do. That no, it's not. Right? God does not forgive intentional sin. Right? If you premeditated murdered someone, that was intentional, and then you had sex with their dead body, that's intentional. That's not unintentional. And we're going to read it in just a moment. God does not forgive intentional sin. God only forgives unintentional sin. If you sinned intentionally, the best you can hope for is mercy. Okay? All right. I also have here in the notes verses 19 through 21. This is a foreshadowing to HaMashiach's first advent, right? Verses 19 through 21. Let's read it again. And also, I'm going to repeat it again. Pay attention now. Nowhere here in verses 19 through 21 do we read that where it says Joseph actually forgave them, because he couldn't do that. They had sinned against him intentionally. All right, verse 19. And Joseph said unto them, oh, and one quick thing. That's why you have to understand the scriptures from a Jewish mindset, an Israelite mindset, right? Including the New Testament, because all the books of the Bible were written by Israelites, Jews. It's a Jewish religion, an Israelite religion. Is meant to be understood through that lens. So when Jesus was saying, forgive that person 70 times 7, that's if his disciples would have already known, and all of the Israelites would have already known. That means if somebody trespasses against me unintentionally, right? If it was an accident, if they come and say, oh, that was an accident, I didn't mean to do that, right? Then you forgive them. But if it would, and you're supposed to forgive them every time, just like how God forgives you every time if it was unintentional. But if it's an intentional trespass, you weren't supposed to forgive them. Okay. Another thing people don't pay attention to with that too is it said your brother, right? But that's a lesson for another day. All right. Now verses 19 through 21. And Joseph said unto them, fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. Just like how it was with HaMashiach at his first advent, right? They meant evil against him, trying to crucify him, right? But his crucifixion with his death, burial, and resurrection was for our good, even though they meant it to be evil against him, trying to crucify him, right? It ended up for all of our good, right? So same thing here with Joseph and what they did to Joseph, it ended up to their good, right? This is a foreshadowing of what would happen with Christ, right? Verses 19 through 21. And Joseph said unto them, fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. Now therefore fear you not, I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spake kindly unto them. All right, now let's go to Numbers 15. And we're going to pick it up at verse 27. Numbers 15. And we're going to pick it up at verse 27. It says here, and if any soul sin through ignorance, then he shall bring a she-goat of the first year for a sin offering, and the priest shall make an atonement for the soul that sinneth ignorantly, when he sinneth by ignorance before the Lord, to make an atonement for him, and it shall be forgiven him. Notice he can have atonement and be forgiven if he trespassed or sinned in ignorance. You shall have one law for him that sinneth through ignorance, both for him that is born among the children of Israel, and for the stranger that sojourneth among them. Verse 30. But the soul that doeth aught presumptuously, right? Aught means wrong, right? The soul that does wrong, that sins. Presumptuously means you thought about it and knew what you was doing was wrong and you did it anyway, right? You did it intentionally. Whether he be born in the land or a stranger, the same reproacheth the Lord, and that soul shall be cut off from among his people, because he hath despised the word of the Lord and hath broken his commandment. That soul shall utterly be cut off. His iniquity shall be upon him. Iniquity meaning sin. Your sin is still on you, meaning it's not forgiven. Why is it not forgiven? Because you sinned intentionally. Okay, this is a key thing to understand about the Bible and what the Bible actually says. Not what you hear stupid Sunday Christians, Roman Catholics saying they don't know the Bible. Right? They're practicing European Gentile nonsense. And it's not their original religion. It's not their original culture. So they don't know what they're doing. Okay. The Bible is real clear on this. And we're going to read it in the New Testament as well from the Apostle Paul in the book of Hebrews. All right. So when you hear people say God forgives, but I don't, right? God doesn't forgive everybody, and God does not forgive everything. That's a misconception. That is not biblically accurate. We just read here in the Torah, God only forgives if you sin in ignorance, meaning it was an accident. If you trespass intentionally, God does not forgive that. And remember, we're supposed to be like God, right? So if God doesn't forgive intentional trespasses, why are you forgiving intentional trespasses? That means you're violating the mitzvah. You're violating the commandment. Okay? You are only supposed to forgive someone if it was an accident. If it wasn't an accident, if they did it intentionally, you can be merciful to them if you so choose, right? But you're not supposed to forgive them. Okay. Again, hopefully this makes sense. All right, now let's go to Hebrews 10 in the New Testament, and Paul's going to tell you the same thing. And we're reading this because, as we just read in Genesis 50, right, they came to Joseph saying, forgive us. We don't read where Joseph says he forgave them. Okay? Doesn't say that. All we read there was that Joseph had showed them mercy. And if you want to be technical, Joseph had already gotten his retribution on them earlier in the book of Genesis for what they did to him. All right. Now, so putting this into terms you can understand in today's world, like, so someone cheated you out of money and it was intentional. Then the Bible is saying you should take them to court and get your money back instead of you, and don't be boo-boo the fool and be like, oh, I forgive you. Like, no, they cheated you out of that money intentionally. Take them to court and get your money back, right? That's proper retribution. The Bible says you can revenge disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. You're keeping the laws, judgments, statutes, and commandments, right? They're keeping the mitzvah. The mitzvah is the commandments, correct? You looked at this situation and you see this person wronged me intentionally. This wasn't an accident, right? Well, then revenge disobedience and take them to court. And I'm giving you one. This is just one example. Like if someone cheated you out of money, take them to court. I had to do that to Jiffy Lube one time back in the day. Jiffy Lube effed up my car. This was back like 20 years ago. Jiffy Lube had effed up my car, and I had to take them to small claims court. They was wrong. They knew they was wrong. It wasn't an accident. Right? It had been proven that it wasn't an accident. It was intentional. And they had messed up other people's cars, and no one had taken them to court because they didn't want to bother with it. And at the time, I was like, I got time today. I'm going to take you to small claims court. And they settled out of small claims court and paid me back for all of the repair fees I had to get done for the car because they knew they were wrong. Okay. And I did not forgive them because it was intentional. Okay. It'd be different if I went to a shade tree mechanic and they had told me in advance, I don't really know what I'm doing. And they're working on the car and they're like, I'm going to try this, but it may or it may not work. And if I do this, this may happen to your vehicle and it may not run anymore, right? Then that wasn't intentional, okay? But the example I'm giving you with Jiffy Lube, they were messing people's cars up intentionally to have them come back to Jiffy Lube to get it fixed, right? And if Jiffy Lube couldn't do it, they had another, this was in Long Beach. It was a Jiffy Lube in Bixby Knolls. I don't know if it's still there now. But anyways, they had another company. What was the name of the company? Not Mako is the one that does paints. What's the one that does, is it Amico? Anyways, it's not relevant. The point is the same people who own the Jiffy Lube also owned and were connected to another repair shop. Because Jiffy Lube normally just does oil changes and minor stuff. But they were effing up people's cars with major problems, like intentionally, so that you would have to go to that other company to get your car fixed. That's what they would recommend. Hey, you go there and get it fixed, and they'll give you a deal or whatever, right? So I didn't forgive them in that case. I took them to court, right? So again, it's the difference between I'll give you another example, right? If you got into a car accident, Maybe they changed lanes and they honestly didn't see you. That's an accident, right? Now, if they were driving drunk and they hit you, right, and killed one of the passengers in your car, that's not an accident. That was intentional. They knew, everybody knows you're not supposed to drink and drive. Okay? Here's another one. They ran a red light. That's not an accident. You saw the light was red. You're not supposed to go through that. That's wrong. You went through the red light anyway and hit somebody and killed a person in that car, right? Their family, the family of the people you killed, should seek retribution on you, right? They shouldn't forgive you. That was intentional, right? Again, hopefully this is making sense. Okay. All right. Now let's go to Hebrews 10, and we're going to read verses 26 through 31. Hebrews 10, verses 26 through 31. For if we sin willfully, after that we have received the knowledge of the truth, there remaineth no more sacrifice for sins. Notice, if you sin willfully, there's no more sacrifice for that. You can't get atonement. What can you expect if you sin willfully? It tells you here in verse 27. But a certain fearful looking for of judgment and fiery indignation, which shall devour the adversaries. He that despised Moses' law died without mercy under 2 or 3 witnesses. Of how much sorer punishment, suppose you, shall he be thought worthy, who have trodden under foot the Son of God, and have counted the blood of the covenant wherewith he was sanctified an unholy thing, and have done despite unto the Spirit of grace, meaning you're abusing grace, right? Don't do that. For we know him that have said, vengeance belongeth unto me, I will recompense, saith the Lord. And again, the Lord shall judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. All right, let's go back to Genesis 50, and we're going to pick it up at verse 20. All right, you wanted a 30-minute warning. That's a 30-minute warning. All right, Genesis 50 and verse 20. All right, back here in Genesis 50 and verse 20. But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. All right, so going back into Genesis 50 and verse 20, what we just read a moment ago, Joseph said here, but as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. All right, let's go to Romans 8 and verse 28. Romans 8 and verse 28. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. And that's what happened with Joseph. They meant evil for Joseph. You know, they thought he was going to die and be sold and be in slavery, right? But it ended up working out for Joseph's good, right? Joseph ended up being a slave and going to prison, but he got removed out of the prison and became prince in Egypt, right? Became prime minister, vice president, went from the jail cell, right? From the cell block all the way to becoming like the vice president, right? And originally this was done to him by people who are trying to do evil towards him. But the evil that they did towards him was really meant by God to be good for him, right? So let's read this again, Genesis 50 and verse 20. You got that, the 30-minute warning. Yeah, go on, man. I want to eat. Like, go. Like, all right, that was a real 30-minute warning. You got now like 25 minutes. All right. Genesis 50 and verse 20. But as for, we're talking about, we want to eat. When I do these lessons late, sometimes I'm not able to eat dinner because of work and other stuff throughout the day, everything that I have to do. And I'm not able to eat dinner before the lesson, so I have to eat it afterwards. And we have some fish we want to put in the oven to go with our spaghetti, you know, nigga style spaghetti and fish. So the fish needs to go in the oven. The spaghetti is already done, but we want fish, and the fish is going to need like 30 minutes in the oven. So I was just giving her a 30-minute warning. That's what I was talking about there. All right. So let's read this again. Genesis 50 and verse 20. But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. All right, Romans 8 and verse 28 in reference to what we just read in Genesis 50 and 20. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. All right, now let's go back to Genesis 50. And we're going to pick it up at verse 22. Genesis 50, and we're going to pick it up at verse 22. All right, it says here, and Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Joseph lived 110 years, and Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were brought up on Joseph's knees. Right? So Joseph was vizier, right, in Egypt, a prince in Egypt, like the prime minister, for a few generations, right? So for the bulk of the 1700s BC, Joseph was prime minister in Egypt, right? And we talked about this before. In the 1700s BC, when you look at the pharaohs list, there's like 50 different pharaohs. They were changing pharaohs like every year or two. Some pharaohs only lasted a few months. Hardly any lasted more than a year or two, right? And so during that whole time, Joseph was the constant in Egypt, right? Until we get to the time of the Hyksos during the second intermediate period. And that's when you have the Pharaoh that arises who knew not Joseph, right? Again, extra learning on your way to learning, right? So I have here in the notes, during Joseph's life, he was vizier in Egypt during the reigns of many pharaohs, right? Let's read it again. And Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house. And Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were brought up upon Joseph's knees. All right, let me see if I can find it. When did Joseph be, how old was Joseph when he was made prime minister? Was he 30? Yeah, he was 30. So, and here he dies at 110 years old. So that means he was prime minister for 80 years, right? So the bulk of the 1700s, Joseph was their prime minister, right? Here in verse 23, it said, and Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were brought up upon Joseph's knees. I have here in the notes for verse 33, brought up upon Joseph's knees. The word in Hebrew for brought up here is yalad, right? Yalad. And you can look this up in the interlinear on your own time in Strong's Hebrew. But yalad means to birth or beget, right? It doesn't mean just to have a kid on your, like how a grandpa will have the kids come get on his lap or on his knee. It means the Hebrew word here goes beyond that. The Hebrew word yalad means to birth or to beget, right? That's what it actually means here, right? To birth or to beget, meaning Moses raised them as if he adopted them, right? Meaning he raised his grandchildren and great-grandchildren as if they were his own sons. He was primarily involved in raising them, right? So it's beyond just having them on his knee when they were little. It means that their grandpa and great-grandpa played an active role in raising them up into adulthood, okay? And that's what that word means in Hebrew. I'll just show it because I know some of you won't go and prove things for yourself. So I'll put it up on the screen so people are without excuse. And that's another one I could have put up from the Targums as well, but I didn't because the Targums also, that's how the Targums read it. He adopted them. All right, let me go back just so y'all see. We're brought up, right? Yalad, Strong's Hebrew 3205.
Strong's H 3205. Yalad. Yalad.
The KJV translates Strong's Hebrew 3205, in the following manner: begat 201 times, bear 110 times, born 79 times, bring forth 25 times, bear 23 times, travail 16 times, midwife 10 times. So this is normally used of a parent, right, and their actual child that they beget. But this was used with Joseph for his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, meaning he raised his great-grandchildren and his grandchildren as if they were his own children, right? Like as if he was like their direct father. All right, child 8 times, delivered 5 times, born 3 times, birth 2 times, labor 2 times, brought up 2 times. Outline of biblical usage: to bear, bring forth, beget, gender, travail, right? I won't go into all the different contexts. Well, we're here. I'm trying to save the time for our brothers and sisters on the East Coast that are on Eastern Standard Time, because I know for y'all it's about to be midnight. But anyways, the qual, to bear, bring forth, right, of childbirth, of distress, of wicked, right, in regards to behavior, to beget, right, the nifal, to be born, right, the pael, to cause or help to bring forth, to assist or tend as a midwife, right, the pual, to be born, the haifel, to beget, right, a child, to bear, right, the hafal, day of birth, birthday, right, the hafpael, to declare one's birth, pedigree, right, yalad, from a primitive root, to bear young, causatively, to beget, medically, to act as midwife, specifically to show lineage, bear, begat, birthday, born, make to bring forth children, all right, to bring up, clave, child, come to be delivered. So y'all get the gist. Let's go back to our notes. Let's read this again. All right, it's for verse 23. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the 3rd generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were brought up upon Joseph's knees. All right, so brought up upon Joseph's knees. The word in Hebrew for brought up here is yalad, which means to birth or beget, meaning Joseph raised them as if he adopted them. 2 of his grandsons were killed in battle, which may be why he raised some of his great-grandchildren. Joseph's great-grandchildren did exploits in Kemet. Kemet meaning ancient Egypt, right? So I'm going to repeat that. 2 of his grandsons were killed in battle, which may be why he raised some of his great-grandchildren. Joseph's great-grandchildren did exploits in Kemet. All right, let's go to Psalm 78, and we're going to read verses 9 through 11. Psalm 78, and we're going to read verses 9 through 11. The children of Ephraim, being armed and carrying bows, turned back in the day of battle. They kept not the covenant of God and refused to walk in his laws, and forgot his works and his wonders that he had showed them. All right, here in Psalm 78, verses 9 through 11, this is literally talking about Ephraim's children. This isn't talking about, and this is talking about his sons. This isn't talking about the northern kingdom. This is talking about Joseph's grandsons. All right, let's read this again. Psalm 78, verses 9 through 11. The children of Ephraim, being armed and carrying bows, turned back in the day of battle. They kept not the covenant of God and refused to walk in his law, and forgot his works and his wonders that he had showed them. All right, so I have here in the notes, this is referring to when Joseph was viceroy, right, prince in Egypt, and because he was prince or viceroy in Egypt for 80 years. This is referring to when Joseph was viceroy, prince in Egypt, and his 2 grandsons died in battle, making a raid into Gaza, southern Palestine. They were defeated by the Philistines. It was sin because they came to steal cattle, right? This is why it says in verse 10, they kept not the covenant of God and refused to walk in his law, right? They were doing a raid. They were coming in to raid and to seize, to steal some of the Philistines' cattle, right? So let's read this again here in Psalm 78, verses 9 through 11. The children of Ephraim, being armed and carrying bows, turned back in the day of battle. They kept not the covenant of God and refused to walk in his law. When it says they turned back in the day of battle, they were defeated, right? And forgot his works and his wonders that he had showed them. So again, this is referring to when Joseph was viceroy or prince in Egypt, and his two grandsons died in battle, making a raid into Gaza, right, southern Palestine, where they were defeated by the Philistines. It was a sin because they had come to steal cattle. All right, let's go to 1 Chronicles 7, and we're going to read verses 20 through 24. 1 Chronicles 7, verses 20 through 24. I'll give you all a moment to turn there. All right, 1 Chronicles 7, verses 20 through 24. And the sons of Ephraim, Shutelah, and Bered his son, and Tahath his son, and Eldah his son, and Tahath his son, and Zabad his son, and Shutelah his son, and Azar, and Eliab, whom the men of Gath that were born in that land slew, because they came down to take away their cattle. All right, the Gathites, those are Philistines. All right, the Philistines supplanted the Avians. The Avians were the original people there, and the Philistines supplanted them in Gath. All right, it says here, whom the men of Gath that were born in that land slew, because they came down to take away their cattle. And Ephraim, their father, mourned many days, and his brethren came to comfort him. And when he went in to his wife, she conceived and bare a son, and he called his name Beriah, because it went evil with his house. And his daughter was Sherah, who built Beth Horon, the nether, and the upper, and Uzan Shererah. Right? So I have here in the notes, Joseph's great-granddaughters built those. It's just great-granddaughter. Oh, yeah, that's why I have it's the plural, not the plural, but the apostrophe one. But I don't need that. All right. So I have here in the notes, Joseph's great-granddaughter built those cities as a princess of Egypt. This is before Kion, the Pharaoh, who knew not Joseph, rose up and put the Israelites in slavery. Right? So Joseph's great-granddaughter was a princess in Egypt, right, and built these cities. Okay, what cities? Excuse me, Beth Horon and Uzan Shererah. Right, this is before Kion, the Pharaoh, who knew not Joseph, rose up. That was a Hyksos, and put the Israelites in slavery. That Pharaoh was an Amorite who descended from the ancient, because remember the Hyksos were Amorites. The Pharaoh was an Amorite who descended from the ancient Assyrian Amorite dynasty, right? Because the Amorites ended up ruling in Assyria for a couple hundred years as well, too, right? And then at the end of that was simultaneously ruling Egypt and Mesopotamia with two different dynasties. But the dynasty in Mesopotamia came to an end, right, at the beginning, like the first part of the Hyksos, right, or their rule or their dynasty in Egypt, right? This is why the Egyptians called them Hyksos, which means rulers of foreign lands, because at the beginning of the Hyksos dynasty in Egypt, they were technically ruling now in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. This is just extra learning on your way to learning. All right. So I have here in the note, Sherah was an Egyptian Hebrew princess, architect, city planner, and engineer. So even though she was a female, right, but she was an architect, a city planner, and an engineer, and she was a princess in Egypt. These were fortified cities built to help subdue uprisings in the land of Canaan, which was under vassalage of Egypt at the time. Right? Because you already started having the bubbling up in Canaan of what would end up becoming the Hyksos taking over Egypt, right? So Joseph's great-granddaughter built fortified cities or stronghold cities in the land of Canaan, right, to help defend them, right, against these uprisings of the Canaanites and to keep the Canaanites in check, because at the time, the Canaanites were a tributary state to Egypt, okay? All right. So I just wanted to point this out because a lot of times when we talk about women in the Bible and we focus on like women who did great things. We will talk about Deborah, but nobody ever mentions Joseph's great-granddaughter. Joseph's great-granddaughter was a princess in Egypt, right? We know this because Joseph was prince, right? He was viceroy. So his daughter is now part of the royal family. She was a city planner, engineer, architect. She's the one who had these fortified cities built, okay? Also, we see here in 1 Chronicles 7 and verses 20 through 24, his grandsons and grandchildren and his grandsons and great-grandsons led military expeditions. The one we just read here didn't turn out to their good because they were wrong in their military in this military expedition, okay? This is just extra learning on your way to learning, but showing you it wasn't, even with Joseph's posterity in Egypt, they did great things as well in Egypt, right? His children, his grandchildren, great-grandchildren. All right, now, let's go back to Genesis 50, and we're going to pick it up at verse 24. Genesis 50, and we're going to pick it up at verse 24. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land onto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from hence. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Right, so I have here in the notes, when Joseph died, they embalmed him, so they mummified him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Many years later, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the sons of Israel swear this oath. All right, the word here, coffin in the Hebrew, it means ark, right? It means ark. The Hebrew word here means ark, making easy, meaning easy to transport later, right? That's why he had himself put in an ark, right? So that it would be easy to transport his body later, okay? Also, remember how with the Ark of the Covenant, like they would move, they had it where they could travel with that without having to touch it. And if somebody touched it who wasn't supposed to touch it, they would die, right? You read about that happening during King David's time. Remember, you touch a dead body, right? Or you touch, even if you touch that coffin, right, where the person's buried, that'll make you unclean, right? So them putting him in an ark allowed them to exhume his coffin, right, which was really like an ark, and carry it without anyone actually touching the coffin, you know, burying it on, like how they would do the Ark of the Covenant, burying, they were able to take up Joseph and transport him from Egypt, right, into the promised land. Let's see here, like 150 years later, right? Now, let's pick it back up here and read this again. Genesis 50, verses 24 through 26. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land onto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from hence. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Right. So when Joseph died, they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Many years later, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the sons of Israel swear an oath. Right. The word coffin here in Hebrew means ark, meaning it was easy to transport later. The other Israelite patriarchs died and were buried somewhere in North or East Africa. Right. And let me fix that typo as well. Right here. All right. All right. So we only read of Joseph, Jacob's 12 sons. We only read in the Bible about Joseph being taken, Joseph's body being taken out of Egypt and buried into the promised land. So that means where are the other 11 bodies of the 12 tribes, right? Patriarchs. This means Judah, Manasseh. Well, I don't want to go off Joseph's sons. I'll use we're just doing Joseph. We're not doing the half tribes. So this means Judah, Zebulun, Naphtali, Reuben, Gad, Dan were all buried in Africa, right? And if you're looking for their body, if you were looking for where they were buried at now, even today, the 12 tribes other than Joseph were buried in either northern Africa or eastern Africa, right? Somewhere in Egypt. Joseph's body was the only one taken out of Egypt and brought into the promised land. That means the other patriarchs, right, of the 12 tribes were all buried in Africa. That's something that a lot of people don't realize when we're reading this story. It's like, okay, yeah, Joseph's body was taken out and was buried into the promised land later, but we don't read in the scriptures where it says the other ones were taken out, right? So that means they were buried. That means they're buried somewhere in northern Africa or eastern Africa, and that's where their bodies still are today. All right, now let's go to Joshua 24, and we're going to pick it up at verse 31. Joshua 24, and we're going to pick it up at verse 31. And I'll give y'all a moment to turn there. And I should have put this one in here too. Hold on. Add a couple audibles. This was going to be our last one, but I want to add a couple more. Give my fish time to do what it do. All right, so instead of going to Joshua first, let's go to Exodus 13 in verse 19. Let's go to Exodus 13 and verse 19 first. I know Spunky. Spunky said, wrap it up. Spunky said, wrap it up. We're almost done. All right. Exodus 13 and verse 19. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had straitly sworn the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones away hence with you. All right, now let's go to Joshua 24, and we're going to pick it up at verse 31. Joshua 24, and we're going to pick it up at verse 31. And Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders that overlived Joshua, and which had known all the works of the Lord that he had done for Israel. And the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, buried they in Shechem, in a parcel of ground which Jacob bought of the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver, and it became the inheritance of the children of Joseph. All right, let's go to Hebrews 11 and verse 22. Hebrews 11 and verse 22, and this is where we're going to close out. Hebrews 11 and verse 22 reads, by faith, Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading, hearing, and doing of his word. In Jesus' mighty name we pray, amen. All right, shalom aleichem, everybody.